I speak and we all hear by the grace of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. Right around the time that I was graduating from college and starting to work, my parents lived for a couple of years in southern Arizona. My dad was assigned to an army post that was close to the border with Mexico. And I visited a few times, and it didn't take long to figure out that there wasn't a lot going on in this town. It was pretty small and it was pretty remote, and so we learned pretty quickly that what you did was you got in the car and you drove to Tucson, because that's where there was the mall and restaurants and modern life going on and more stuff. But the trouble was that the minute you left this town to drive to Tucson, you were really, truly in the middle of nowhere. There was almost nothing between this town and Tucson. And we would joke that you'd find our bleached bones by the side of the road if we ever broke down. And so you were pretty careful to think about, do I have enough gas in the tank of the car before I start to make it all the way on the trip? Now, this was not 1920. We had a modern car and we were in the early days of cell phones, so there were ways to be in contact. It wasn't like you would truly be stranded, but there would be the embarrassment of having to call somebody and say, I'm stuck, I didn't do the right calculations, can you come help me? And you'd have to live that down for a while. So it was worth it to think about, do I have what I need to make it all the way to where I want to go? This, in a spiritual sense, is what Jesus is talking to the people in the crowd in the gospel story this morning about. He's had these larger and larger crowds following him for a while as he becomes more and more notorious. There's the little group of people who are his faithful followers who've been with him all along. But in my mind's eye, at least, I imagine larger and larger numbers of people who have not really been around to hear the whole message. And as I've been saying to you for a few weeks, Jesus' sense of urgency is rising. So he's more and more pressed to make sure that the people who are around him understand his message, understand what it means to follow him, even to where he's going, which is Jerusalem and the cross. So he wants to be sure he has their attention. And he begins in a way that is guaranteed to make sure everybody is listening to him. He begins by saying, you have to hate everybody. In order to be my follower, you have to hate your family and your friends. And surely these are striking and shocking words. Now I want to be really clear to say quickly that Jesus does not mean to say that we're supposed to hate anyone. In fact, the word that we use, hate, in this case in Greek means something much more complicated. It involves what we love more and what we love less. And there's a whole other sermon or sermons wrapped up in what it means to love some things more and love some things less, and how we make those decisions and how we properly put ourselves and our family and our friends and God in perspective in our lives. That's for another time. Today, I don't want us to lose sight of the middle part of the story, where Jesus is talking about this calculation, figuring out what it means to have enough. Whether it's building a tower or going out into battle, whatever you're going to do you have enough to get where you need to go? This is important for a couple of reasons. The first is because, as you and I know and have learned over the course of our lives, the Christian life isn't always easy. We look around ourselves and we see other people who seem to manage pretty well with some other faith or no faith at all. In fact, at times it is more difficult to live a faithful Christian life than it would be to live a completely faithless life. The energy that is required to think in every situation about what God would have us do and then to do it can be a burden. But it is what we are called to, dear friends, and if we didn't believe that, we wouldn't be sitting here this morning. The second, and perhaps even more complicated reason, is because we kind of like unfinished towers, don't we? At another time in my growing up, we lived in the Middle East. And driving around the city where we live, we noticed that every house, almost, had rebar sticking up out of the top of it. And it seemed odd that nobody ever had the money to finish their house. Was nobody doing these calculations correctly? Until we finally found out that you only paid taxes on the house once it was finished. As long as it was under construction, you only paid taxes on the ground under it. So people left the rebar sticking out the top. Their house was never really finished, and they never paid any taxes on it. We do that in our lives too, don't we? Sometimes it's nice to think, well, maybe I'll get there, but maybe it won't be today. St. Augustine famously wrote, "Dear Lord, make me holy, but not right away." Sometimes we'd like to put it off just a little bit, and yet we can't. Sooner or later, the time comes when the tower must be finished. There are times when decisions must be made. And it's too late when we get to that point to finish the tower. It must be done before we get there. So it is that we are confronted with this need to make these calculations in our head, to know what it is that we have in our spiritual gas tank, to know what it is that we are able to accomplish. We see this in the story this morning from Philemon. This is actually almost the entire book that we hear read in church this one time every 3 years. There are just a couple of verses at the end where Paul sends greetings to other people. Other than that, we hear pretty much the whole thing. And this is one of those times when, if you had been with us in seminary, you would know this is a laugh-producing story. Seminarians, when they hear this read, are smiling and giggling just a little bit because Paul is really laying it on thick. He is really not sparing anything here in really twisting Philemon's arm to do what it is that he wants him to do. Not that you don't owe me more, that I'm asking you, the sort of language you would use. It can be read even a little more sarcastically, perhaps. Because Paul really does know what he wants, and he's operating from a position of weakness. So he's going to pull out all the stops to try to get what it is that he wants for someone whom he has come to love. We know really very little other than what we read in the story, but we can kind of infer, perhaps, that Onesimus has been a slave who has run away. Maybe he's even stolen something on his way out of town. Somehow he's wound up with Paul. Maybe he met him when Paul was with these people originally. And Paul has somehow converted him, turned him into not merely a believer in Jesus, but his own sort of personal assistant. And now Paul is asking these people, of whom Philemon is the leader, to accept Onesimus back. This has some costs, I'm sure. It may be that Philemon is being asked to take on a literal monetary cost for the sake of his faith. It may be that if, in fact, Onesimus did steal something, by taking him back, Philemon is agreeing to make sure this gets repaid. Paul is writing from prison. There's no guarantee he's ever going to get out. There's no guarantee he's ever going to be able to come back or pay anybody for anything. So if they take this man back, they are essentially saying, we'll take Paul's word for it, and if we never get paid, so be it. On the other hand, there may also be a social cost. Onesimus left as a slave. Now, Philemon is becoming Paul's agent in bringing this person back into the community. He's read Paul's words. Now he has to turn around to everybody else and say, we have been asked to take this person back, not just in the form that he was before, not just as a slave, but now as a member of the community. And maybe even more, maybe as a leader of the community, because he's been with Paul, he's become Paul's associate, and he knows what it is that Paul wants us to know. We have to accept him back as someone very different from the person he left as. This happens to us all the time, doesn't it, dear friends? Those around us change in ways that we can't predict. All of us, I think, have had someone in the course of our lives who's hurt us. a family member, a friend, a coworker, a boss, a customer, someone who has then come back to us, or who may yet come back to us, maybe different. And it is a challenge to us as faithful people to understand that in that moment, we may not merely have to accept that person back, recognize who he or she has become, but rejoice at what God has done in his or her life. That was what Philemon was being asked to do, and that is also what you and I are asked to do. Do we have enough gas in the tank to do it? It's been the problem for the church through all of its history. The history of the church for the last 2,000 years has been splitting and splitting and splitting and splitting. It's very easy to say that the people who are no longer around us in the pews have nothing to tell us, while we imagine that they're saying the same about us from wherever it is that they have gone. How much harder and yet how much more godly to imagine the possibility that God continues to speak to them and through them to us, as much as God continues to speak to us and through us to them. All of this is not easy. It requires spiritual gas in the tank. And yet it can be very easy to miss those opportunities for refreshment when they come up. I don't know about you, but I will confess, while standing here, that more than once I have been driving more or less on fumes and have gone past a gas station after gas station saying, that price is too high, I'll go on to the next one. We can never know where those sources of refreshment are going to come. We cannot afford to pass them up. Because, as I say, by the time we realize that the tank is approaching empty, it's likely to be too late to fill it up. So where are your sources of refreshment? How are you doing on this? Do you have the people and the resources, the places, the practices that you need to ensure that your gas tank is always full? We know that Philemon somehow did. Whatever else we may or may not know about this story, all of the commentators agree that we know about this story because Philemon delivered. Had he not done what it was Paul wanted to do, we would never have heard this story. We also must be ready to ensure that that story can be told about us after our time. We hear in the psalm that they're like trees planted by streams of water. And the water is always running by us. The resources are always there if we will simply stop and notice them. If we are feeling that perhaps the tank is getting a little empty, the good news is that we are open for business. There are resources here. There are opportunities. Now is the time to take them up. Now, as the summer is ending and the season, whatever that means, is beginning, there are chances to learn new things, to pray in new ways, to serve in new ways, new opportunities to ensure that the tank is always full. My prayer for you and for me is that in this new season, the tower will be complete. We will find ways to ensure that we are refreshed spiritually, ready to meet whatever challenges God may send to us. Amen.